it's about, looking at how do we build a new system? How do we get out of the boxes we were in before? And how do we create a system that is reflective and accessible to the community, to the entire community? And so definitely as we talk about that, the issues of equity and diversity need to be highlighted, need to be discussed. They are there front and center. And we are really excited. We have a dynamic panel to address this issue, which is so critical to the whole discussion on career development. So it's my pleasure to introduce the moderator for this panel. We're thrilled she's here, Alexandra Oliver-Davila, who is the Executive Director of Sociedad Latina, and who's going to moderate that. And I'm going to let Alexandra introduce the panel, but I want to thank you all for being here, and I look forward to what you have to say.
Thank you so much. Again, my name is Alexandra Oliver-Davila. Just call me Alex. When I hear Alexandra, I always feel like I'm in trouble. So I'm really excited to be part of today and really excited to actually meet over Zoom the panelists for today. Having looked you up, you're very impressive, and I know we're going to get a lot of really great information. So we have Orrin W, who's the Director of College and Career Success from Way Delaware. I just want to say I'm a huge Way fan. I'm actually a person that donates to Way, so I encourage everybody to do so. And Janay McClarin, Engagement Manager, National Association for Partnerships and Equity, and Sharon Givens, President of National Career Development Association. So today, we are going to talk about diversity in a little bit of a different way. I know when people hear the word diversity and workplace diversity, sometimes they may cringe. It's a sensitive conversation, and usually, unfortunately, not posed in a positive one. I'm here to say that those days are over, and that really workplace diversity has to be the norm. So you're going to just have to get comfortable. And that it is what it is. It's even beyond, that it's the right thing to do. It is the right thing to do. But it's a new paradigm when we look at how the world has changed, how, the globe has changed, how our cities have changed demographically. And, we all know that diverse teams make for better teams and lead to more successful outcomes. And the more diversity on a team, the greater chance of having different perspectives and different lived experiences that people are bringing to the table. And the more diversity on a team, the greater the creativity and ability to problem solve. And then additional benefits include increased productivity and profits. More than ever, employers are prioritizing diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives and investing resources into making sure that their teams are set up for success. And ultimately, this results in high impact competitive organizations, institutions, businesses with high levels of employee engagement. And according to a McKinsey report, gender diverse companies are 25% more likely to outperform their peers, while ethnically diverse businesses are 36% more likely to perform better than their competitors. And despite this documented evidence regarding the advantages of diverse workplaces, many organizations, institutions, businesses, employers all struggle to implement a successful diversity recruitment and also retention. So it's beyond recruitment, but also retention. And so we're going to talk about what can you do to improve your diversity recruitment and retention strategy. So as I said earlier, rather than focusing on why diversity and equity is important, because it is, and if you're not in that place, I strongly encourage a lot of self-reflection and a lot of reading, and happy to talk to anybody. But like I said, those days are over. We're there. It is important. It only benefits our workplace. We're going to chat with these three individuals who are going to share the positive impacts and successes that they are seeing, because they are not just talking, but also walking the talk. So I'm going to ask each panelist to introduce themselves briefly and just tell us about their role and their organization, and then go right into the first question, which is in what positive ways has focusing on diversity and equity impacted the culture of your organization, your staff, your colleagues? What value is diversity bringing into your organization? Basically, you know, how are you generating buy-in around that? So I'm going to start with Sharon Givens. Again, she is the president of the National Career Development Association. Sharon.
Yes.
Thank you for being on this panel.
So just a heartfelt thanks for having me as a part of this very important conversation. So I'm certainly excited to be here today. And I'm actually president-elect of the National Career Development Association. My actual tenure as president will begin October 1st. So I'm very excited about that. But the way our organization works, we come in as president-elect, and then president-elect, and then president. So we have a really, really rich opportunity to begin our platform and initiatives that we have in place to perform. So the National Career Development Association is actually the largest career development association in the world. So we do have a pretty large global presence. Our focus, of course, is research, professional development, publications. We try to set standards actually for practitioners who are in this field. Also credentialing, but most importantly, I would say, is advocacy. That's a major role of our association. The association is actually divided into 4 different constituency groups, and that would be counselor educators, of course, individuals who work in academia, who are teaching counseling, but more importantly, career-related courses as well. And then we have our K through 12 constituency group, which are professionals who work in some capacity in high school, middle schools, K through 12. And that's a group that I think is really important. And I just have to say, in my state, we have professionals that work in every middle, elementary, and high school facilitating career development services. The next constituency group would be higher ed, which is our actual largest group. And these are professionals that work in primarily career centers or either doing academic advising on some level, but they're on college campuses. The last constituency group, which was the group that I was the trustee for prior to becoming president-elect, is private practitioners, business and industry, and agencies. So this group is comprised of government, individuals who are facilitating career development in federal or state government agencies, career counselors in private practice, coaches, and also human resources, folks that are working in human resources, could be doing recruitment, training, but facilitating career development at some level. We have ongoing initiatives, I have to say, that I'm most proud of to implement diversity and inclusion practices within the association. And I'm looking forward to talking more about that later. Someone said earlier in their other life, I was a counselor educator, and I returned back to practice. I actually am licensed to practice in 3 different states. I have a practice in South Carolina and North Carolina, and I actually facilitate career counseling, of course, psychotherapy, and coaching, and career assessment and testing. My areas of expertise, I would actually, probably a few areas would be integrating career development and mental health, which I think is very, very important. Of course, diversity and inclusion, and employee mental fitness. And a lot of that has come about just from people experiencing even racial trauma in the workplace, and how do they navigate that, and still remain productive employees. So again, I'm glad to be here and I look forward to contributing to the conversation.
Thank you so much, Sharon. I'm going to ask Janay McClarin, again, Engagement Manager for National Association for Partnerships and Equity. If you could introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about your role, your organization, and also, again, back to the same question for all the panelists. If you could talk about the positive ways that focusing on diversity and equity has impacted the culture of your organization, your colleagues, staff, and what value is diversity bringing into your organization? How are you really generating that buy-in? And thank you for being with us today.
No, thank you for having me. I really am happy to be here. I appreciate the invitation and opportunity to share in this amazing experience. So the National Alliance for Partnership and Equity, NAPE for short, we are a membership consortium and we consist of state members, local and regional organizations, as well as individuals, all with one focus in mind: increasing access for our students, speaking around equity and workforce diversity. Our line of business focused mainly on professional development, research evaluation, advocacy spaces in the area of public policy, and providing technical assistance. And so my role in all of that is I do provide professional development. I oversee our partnerships, external partnerships more specifically. And then I am the point person for our national summit, which we just completed last month. And it was really exciting to see so many people who are ready to have the most important conversation around equity. To your question, I think when we think about why equity is important, especially for an organization like NAPE, where it's in our name, it would behoove us to make sure that it is what we live and breathe and not just the title that's on our name badges. But I think for us, it creates this idea of a holistic engagement. A lot of times when we are working in spaces, we tend to work in silos. We don't get to know the people that we work with, so we don't truly understand what value they bring to the table and to the conversation. And I think one thing that COVID and the whole work from home has taught us as we sit in our Zoom offices, that we start to see our colleagues in a different light. We start to see when the kids interrupt the catwalk across the screen. My mother, perfect example, just came in and asked me was I on camera, and I couldn't turn my head to say, yes, I was on camera. But we all present a professional us, and we present a personal us, and rarely do those worlds intersect. And so because we are working from home, because we are now in other people's living rooms, bedrooms, garages, wherever you're relegated to have your Zoom offices, we're starting to see people as people and not just commodities within an organization. So the value of that diversity and understanding the different cultural ramifications that people deal with on a day-to-day basis, but also how those various cultural pieces build who they are and how those pieces can contribute to the business models that you are creating, especially for us because we do so much training outside of NAPE. We're a really small organization and we were already virtual to begin with. And so we do have the luxury, and I call it a luxury, to go out and meet other people who are wanting to learn more about equity. So we get to see people in the learning space. And so this is very exciting when people want to take equity to the next level, to want to have conversations around diversity, to want to move the needle beyond the surface diversity that we have seen so often. And so I do feel that the value add is just the humanness of diversity that it brings to the workplace, to the conversation, because when we can see each other as people and start to relate and pull back those many, many layers of the different aspects that make up our own individual cultures, it creates a more dynamic working experience. So thank you again for allowing me to be in this space with you today.
No, thank you so much. And I had my daughter in here, if you probably saw me trying to, so I get it. I had to rush and pick her up from school. I understand, but I think you make such a valid point. I think so many people dislike Zoom, but I do think there are some silver linings from, Zoom or Microsoft Teams, whatever you're using, which is that intimacy that has been created and I think allowed for more learning. And that is a great thing. Sounds like you and Sharon are doing some really exciting work. And so I'd like to introduce Orrin White, Director of College and Career Success, United Way, Delaware, and ask you the same question, Orrin, in what positive ways has focusing on diversity and equity impacted the culture of your organization, your colleagues, your staff, and what value is diversity bringing into your organization, and how are you creating buy-in? And thank you for being on this panel.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you for the kind introduction. And it's an absolute pleasure to be here with you all today. First, let me begin with extending thanks and gratitude to Dr. Solberg, Janet Bray, Robin, Spencer Murray, and the entire planning team for their flawless execution of the National Career Development Virtual Conference. I really hope everyone is enjoying the learning and sharing that has taken place over these past few days. And to your point, Alex, I would be remiss if I did not call out and name the work that we all collectively have ahead of us, and that is focused on equity and also on access. To be blunt, at the United Way of Delaware, we believe far too many of our Black and Brown students and families live in poverty and simply exist in crisis on a daily basis. And this has been made more difficult, this has been made more difficult by the pandemic known as COVID-19. I am pleased to be joined by my colleagues on this panel in discussing the critical strategies and evidence-based best practices that will ultimately meet the needs of children from diverse and underserved backgrounds across the country. To talk a little bit about who I am, my name is Dr. Orrin White, and I serve as the Director of College and Career Success at the United Way of Delaware. I am a national and regional youth development expert, facilitator, and also a consultant. To talk a little bit about the work of United Way of Delaware, at its core, our mission is to maximize the community's resources to improve the quality of life. And our vision is advancing the common good by creating opportunities for all. Simply put, our why is that we believe that social change and outcomes matter. Again, we believe that too many children live in poverty and too many families exist in crisis. United Way of Delaware uniquely amplifies individual, corporate, and partner resources that drive social change through collective impact. This collective impact model dramatically changes the trajectory of our state and also our future. We believe that this can be accomplished through a holistic approach, through a community continuum strategy, focusing on communities of greatest need, which we identify throughout our state as our promise communities. It represents 8 areas throughout the state of Delaware and 17 zip codes. From a database perspective, there's a little over 900,000 Delawareans that call Delaware home, and over 300,000 Delawareans call one of these promise communities home. And these have been earmarked as the areas of highest need that are most impoverished or have lacked to those resources. Our home program areas are consistent around closing student opportunity gaps, college and career success, financial stability, and empowerment. And we are driving this through investments, programs and advocacy that is aligned through diverse partnerships. Now, to focus a bit on your question, Alex, we believe that equity is not the same as equality. We are really focused on making sure that all students, and an emphasis on all, have equal access to a high quality education is indeed the goal. But the truth remains that some students need more assistance to access that education. Given students who come to school lagging academically because of factors outside of that school's control, the exact same resources as that students who are on target will not close the achievement gap. School districts will need to be ready to provide these vulnerable students more than other students and bravely defend those choices to do so. Essentially, when we focus on our work, United Way of Delaware is not a direct service organization. So as I sit before you today, I am really representing the incredible work of over 200 plus community-based organizations who are working on the front line to ensure the success of our young people. And the critical questions that we're asking is, how do we connect and interconnect? Not an us and a them, but truly a desire to break down silos in favor of partnerships that truly benefit the outcomes of all youth. We all have important qualities that support positive youth development and build youth success. And the question that we've been consistently asking ourselves is, how do we bring those pieces together?
Thank you so much. And you did such a great introduction, which I should have done. Thank you, everybody. That was really great. I was looking for my headphones and I was a little bit lost. So thank you. And apologies that I didn't call you doctor. You earned that. That's a
Oh,
big
it's not
deal.
a problem, Alex.
So
Not-
no, it's a big, big deal. And it leads to what you were talking about, that unfortunately, when we look across sectors, when we look in education, healthcare, philanthropy, we do not see diversity in the boardrooms. We do not see diversity in management. And, you know, you are an unfortunate walking statistic of being a doctor. Myself, you know, having a master's, hopefully we'll have my doctorate in a few years. But these, you know, these are like realities. And I think you said so well when you talked about COVID. And I think for many people of color, it was not a surprise when we saw the disparities that COVID highlighted, and we knew that they were already there. And when we look at, you know, who was hit hardest, we look at employment rates, we look at, you know, deaths, illness, and we look at, you know, loss of employment or employment hours, the digital divide, et cetera. And we know that that we have larger, broader issues, which I think is what, you know, what this conversation, why it's even more urgent, that we really think about how we create, you know, diverse workplaces, how we create those pathways for young people, as you were talking about. And so my next question, I'm going to go back to Sharon to ask about and the work that you do. It seems like you are working in a lot of different spaces, but across those spaces that you're working in, can you talk a little bit about what are some big takeaways or learnings from focusing on diversity and equity? And what are your diversity and inclusion best practices? And if you could share some success stories. So I think oftentimes, you know, unfortunately, it's looked at like an HR thing, very, very shallow. So if you could talk a little bit from your perspective of working,
Sure.
as you described, what are those best practices? And if you could share some success.
Sure. So kind of just picking up maybe from the first question, when I think about it in context of the association, just embracing diversity, equity, and inclusion, I think that's really powerful for our brand identity, for us to be seen as an association, an organization that embraces. And not only just looking at diversity, I think one of the mistakes that are made is looking at diversity, looking at equity, looking at inclusion, and looking at those separately versus integrating all three. Because even if you have a diverse staff or diverse group, but inclusion is not involved or the equity piece is not involved, then there's still an issue. So I think what's really critical is looking at how do we integrate, embrace all three. And when I think about just one example with the association, we have one of our strongest committees, I would say, is the Diversity and Inclusion Committee within our association. And they work primarily to create, of course, it's a dedicated group to create pathways for, number one, engagement, because we look at the numbers, we have diverse people within the association, but are they engaged? Do they feel like they have the permission to serve? And that's very powerful. I'm here at the table, but do I have the permission to contribute? Do I feel welcome to contribute my skills or talents within this space? And I think that's very powerful. One of the other things that we did, and really the response was amazing, because we did a survey, we reviewed our membership, and we looked at the person that wasn't at the table, the person that wasn't a member of the association? How many Black male counselors did we have? So we offered, which was one of the things through the Diversity and Inclusion Committee, a breakfast and invited these people. It was their responsibility to go and recruit and say, we have you here. What do you need? How do we get you involved? We know how many students of colors, how many clients of colors that actually need assistance, but we don't have you at the table. So that was one of the major efforts that we did. The other thing that we're doing that should be ready and available next year is we're now updating our career development competencies for counselors, which is very critical. It's important for folks in this field to have standards. And we feel like as a part of the association, it's our obligation to prepare our providers and practitioners to actually be equipped to work with diverse groups.
Thank you so much, Sharon. I think you make such a great point. I can't underscore enough, which is, as a person of color leading an organization, whether you are an organization that is led by a person of color or an organization that is all, people of color, I think it's still a conversation, right? It's still a journey. And you can't take for granted that just because you have people of color sitting around the table, it is so important to be inclusive and to really look at it as a journey. And I think so true, like who is missing, at the table, and then all of the different things that come. Even I think of myself, like in my organization, we focus working with Latino youth, and when people think of Latinos, they think, oh, it's just one culture, and it's really not. And there's a lot of nuances, a lot of different stereotypes, and so making sure to have the space to have those conversations. So true. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I'm gonna now turn to Janay, and same question. If you could talk about the big takeaways or learnings from focusing on diversity and equity, and if you could talk about some of the best practices and share a few success stories with us.
Absolutely. One of the things that I think about a lot is when we started thinking about COVID and the racial disparities happened this past year that we all watched, and our focus was because we were all at home. And I often think if we had been in our normal workspaces, would we have paid that much attention to it? And so because we were in essence homebound, we had to really take stock in what was going on. We could no longer pass the buck and say, that's not happening in my neck of the woods. That's not happening in the spaces that I work and breathe. But in doing that, we have to be careful to not regulate diversity, equity, inclusion, access to one person or to one department. The equity officer can't be your equity plan. The diversity council can't be your equity plan. It has to start top down. There has to be tremendous buy-in from leadership. And I think what we've seen in organizations we work with, but also what we've seen at NAEP, because a lot of times people think, oh, because you have it in your title and you do it, that you don't ever slip, but we slip. And so specifically when the Black Lives Matters was happening and the statement was being drafted, a lot of heated conversations happened because people were speaking from lived experiences. And at that point, it was clear to us that we hadn't done our own work in some ways, that we were so busy doing the work for others that we hadn't taken the time to do some self-inventory, because again, we regulated those conversations to certain people in the organization. And so one takeaway from me is that you have to look at equity as a plan that includes everybody and not just the one person. And typically that one person is a person of color. And so that in some ways tokenizes them, but it also puts a lot of pressure on that person to be the end all be all for everybody in the organization. That can't be the person who you put out front when it's time to make the statement. That can't be the person that you go to say, okay, this is a problem, how do we do that? Or when you have a training, make sure you have one person of color who can speak to that audience. It's really important that it's a cross collaboration across all departments and that it's everybody's responsibility. And in doing that, one of the other things that we focused on as we were doing trainings was people would come to the trainings, they would come to the technical assistance and be really excited. And then we would follow back up and just to check and see how things were going, and nothing had happened. And what we saw was leadership, the policymakers, the folks who write the checks were not at the table. They were sitting representatives because that made them look as if they were doing the work. And by no means is that a dig to anyone. It's just simply what we figured out was that you have to engage the decision makers if you want to get it done. It does me no good at all to train your staff if upper management administration is not going to be a part of that conversation, because the staff can only do so much. So we created an Equity Leadership Institute and really encouraged leaders to come so they could sit and soak what we were saying. And then we made it where it wasn't a magic bullet or here's what you have to do. If you go back and do these 5 things, then you'll be equitable and everyone will be great. Like, it really was about doing the work. And so that was one thing that we really focused on, and seeing the success and the response of having people sign up for that Leadership Institute. And then the other piece that was near and dear to me, I've been doing a lot of work in the spaces of apprenticeship and workforce and working with youth. And one of the things that we've been focused a lot on is the importance of youth voice. I always find it a tremendous disservice that we're going to serve a community, but we don't invite that community to the table. To Sharon's point, you know, we say, come and join us, but we never mic them up. We never say, what do you think? So we tell them what they think. We tell them what they need, and then we're surprised when it doesn't work. So we invited a leadership group this summer, and we required that they had a member of the youth community, a student had to be a part of the leadership group. And we also paid that student, because that was the other piece of it, that a lot of times when students are involved, we want to use their experience and their expertise, but we don't compensate them properly. And so it was really important for us that we gave students a voice, that we made them feel a part of this opportunity, and the return on investment was huge. They spoke at our conference. It was one of the most attended sessions. It was very raw and real to hear a student tell a bunch of administrators, what you're doing does not work for me. And if you want me to be successful, then you need to hear me. So I think giving voice and speaking truth to power was really vital for us, and it was a learning experience. And we've continued to see the benefits from that piece.
Such great points. You are speaking my language. I work with young people, so I could not agree more. I think whether it's young people or families, if you are doing the work and you're saying that you're representing, policies cannot be made, programs cannot be made without those they are trying to represent, to be part of the conversation. In my own organization, similarly, we have a pipeline. We have alumni who stay with us until, some of them are even like 28, 30 years old. They're still with us. It's really wonderful. But being able to think about that as like a pipeline for our diversity. And you made another, I think, really wonderful point, which is, I think, one, this is my own pet peeve and may not be everybody's, but I think when you start looking at having a committee that's dedicated to, diversity, equity, inclusion, I always find that really problematic, because I think it's everybody's responsibility. It's similar to the notion that you have staff in a school that is like a family engagement person, and then they're looked at as having the complete responsibility of getting families engaged, when really it should be the custodian, the receptionist, the teacher, the principal, the lunch monitor, the bus monitor. So thank you for making those points. And I'm going to move to Orrin now and ask you the same question. Orrin, if you could talk about big takeaways or learnings from focusing on diversity and equity, and some best practices and success stories. And I think, you have your United Way hat, and then you're also working with other organizations. So whichever you feel comfortable talking about, either or both, up to you.
Absolutely, Alex. And I think I'm going to dovetail with my colleagues who really talked about the role of community-based organizations, but also kind of under the umbrella of COVID-19, which has really been a focus for all of us. But specifically to speak to the members, employers of industry, we know that community-based organizations provide the best insights into the on-the-ground needs and as well as the cultural context for clients from diverse backgrounds, leveraging their idiosyncratic trust from a long history of engagement in that community. And I think the questions that we've really asked ourselves in terms of how they advance equity is what can community-based organizations do in this space and what's being done well in this space. Chief amongst them is providing that additional capacity to state leaders in districts for which to support more students in expanding their career and their life goals, as well as supporting the development of critical employability skills to be successful learners and successfully matriculate into the post-secondary, into the workforce. I think if I was to frame this thought, it's that community-based organizations cannot just be a part or a thought, but they must be integrated and a thoughtfully embedded part of the solution. Across the country, we're seeing state plans for accelerating student learning, including a range of new strategies and targeted interventions. We know that states are developing multi-tiered systems of support, and they are now examining potential partnerships to address not only academic needs, but also social and emotional needs and competencies, which includes efforts to intentionally provide more learning during and after school. Simply put, employers today are looking for what they call deep human skills in the future of their workforce, but we recognize these skills as advanced social and emotional learning skills. It's about helping youth to make those important linkages between those developed skills and their talents, and helping these same young people, Black and Brown and Latinx, identify how that skill or that talent aligns to the future world of work. Alex, I would be remiss if I didn't think about reflecting to my attendance of a brown paperback session a few weeks ago, in which I had the opportunity to learn about the phenomenal work that Sociedad Latina is doing and their after-school program and their summer program in Boston to help youth really develop those skills that they need to successfully enter key high demand and high wage jobs. Sharing those best practices, hearing those terms such as ensuring those young people were confident, that they were competent, that they were proud of their culture, and really focusing on education, workforce development, civic engagement, arts and culture, but most in chief of importance, Dr. Sober, thanking you for the invitation, is partnering with Boston University to integrate the critical STEAM curriculum and programming being funded through the National Science Foundation. So I will certainly allow you to speak more to that. But for me, in terms of talking about best practices for us, we know that COVID-19 has changed everything. And we know this full well. However, for many Delawareans who were living week to week before COVID, the cascading impact on their finances, their health, and on the education of their children has been nothing short of catastrophic. A report published by McKinsey and Company laid out the implication of education opportunity gaps with a specific focus on children of color and those who come from impoverished or underrepresented areas, who forecast to be impacted most. From a data perspective, the McKinsey and Company report forecasted that all children, regardless of their race, their color, or their creed, will be suffering from a minimum of 6 months of learning loss. But when we disaggregate that data and we begin to look at race and socioeconomics, we know that for Black and Brown students, that number jumps from 6 months to 9 months of average learning loss. But when we look at simply low-income children, that number jumped to a full calendar year of average learning loss due to the pandemic known as COVID-19. But to talk about some of those best practices, I encourage everyone that there is hope. In the middle of this pandemic, in partnership with 21 community-based organizations, the Longwood Foundation, the City of Wilmington, numerous corporate and individual donors, and most of Delaware school districts, from Brandywine School District in the north to Seaford School District in the south, United Way of Delaware acted with urgency to raise $1 million to establish or maintain 26 COVID learning pods in some of Delaware's most underrepresented communities. These professionally staffed, Safety compliant learning pods now help keep more than 700 Delaware students from falling further into the academic achievement gap. But to bring up those concepts of equities, for those that are familiar with learning pods, we know that a lot of this had to do with income and finances. Though those from more affluent communities had the resources for which to bring in a singular teacher and pull together pods of young individuals as districts began to go from a hybrid to a virtual format. But again, for Black and Latinx students and students that come from more impoverished communities, that simply wasn't the case. United Way of Delaware was proud to stand with our community-based organizations to close that gap. In the COVID context, a learning pod is simply a small group of students who study together in person in a safe, supervised location outside of the classroom. But these learning pods offer so much more. They offer computer and internet access, academic coaching, homework and study assistance, nutritional meals, and most of all, for our young people, this was a safe and supervised place for children to remain focused on their school. Also critical to the success of this reimagined approach to education has been United Way establishing the Learning Pod Community of Practice, which features those same 20 community-based organizations that are now standing up over 26 Learning Pod statewide. And the goal for the community of practice was to meet weekly to share what those best practices would look like, and also to help our children and their families meet the challenges of virtual learning during a global pandemic. And to talk a little bit about the data has been absolutely encouraging. Across the Learning Pod Collaborative, we've seen 86% across the collaborative of young people attending their Learning Pod. 83% of our young people are successfully turning in their assignments. And then 94% of all of these young people were successfully participating in social and emotional learning outcomes. From an academic performance perspective, we saw 61 of those 719 students make honor roll, and over 100 students in grade K through 12 have made significant academic improvement, which means they came to the pod in danger of failing, and now they are successfully passing all of those classes. Also, what I would like to call out is the importance of equity and diversity as it relates to staff and administration that some of my colleagues has always talked about. We know that the ratios that sometimes take place in school often ostracize our Black and brown young people. Within these pods, we were able to have an average of 1 teacher to 7 students. 57% of the Learning Pod staff reside in the communities that they serve, and we know how it is important for our young people to see the individuals that are providing their instruction that look like them, that sound like them, and can assist them in that regard. And 40% of the administrators resided in the communities that they serve. So simply put, this has been a good investment in advancing equity and is also advancing diversity because there's a groundwork for success that is in place. There's an infrastructure and a coordinated inter-organizational platform that is constantly improving performance week over week for our most impoverished young people. We have a network of school districts, community organizations, and supporters that are both strong and active. And finally, the community of practice has the metrics and standards that ensure the fidelity to the curriculum that is being offered by their school district.
Orrin, I think you're my new favorite person. Thank you for coming to the Sociedad Latina conversation brown bag lunch, and thank you, Scott, for facilitating that. But are you a new dad? Was that you?
That is me.
Congratulations again. Thank you for being part of that. I think you just said so many important things. I think as we saw. As we have seen during COVID, and hopefully will continue, I think the support of community-based organizations that have the cultural and linguistic expertise and trust of the community is so important. This work cannot be done without those organizations. I know in my own organization, we were able to retain 100% of students from last year through this year, through COVID, through the virtual world, providing engagement, enrichment opportunities, academic supports. We're able to provide cash assistance. We were able to translate for families with teachers to be able to get food, to be able to help people navigate when they could collect unemployment or some of the special opportunities that came out around like rental relief. And I say that because it's really important that we value those community-based organizations because they already have that trust and because they are multilingual, multicultural, and the nonprofit sector has been hit very hard with COVID. And unfortunately, there's so much research around that there's just not enough organizations that are led by people of color, or that the management are people of color, and they don't get the same type of funding because they're, there's a lot of bias, et cetera. And, I think in Boston, I think about the work that I'm doing that is beyond the purview of the organization. Like, we are doing vaccine clinics, like, who knew that we'd be signing people up, or like being, on the ground, getting people education and having them be less scared and helping them to get to those places and get those appointments. And if there had been more of us, then I think we'd be in a different place. Like, as an example, there are more Sociedad Latinas out there, we'd be in a different place in terms of like vaccination, as an example. So I think it's just so important. And what you said too around the reflection, I think many times we hear like there's not staff that have the experience, we can't find people to hire. And I think I think Janay also pointed that out. It's like our youth are sitting right here. And we should be building those pipelines within our school. And when we look at K-12, when we look at higher education, it's so important that our students actually have people that look like them teaching them. And that doesn't mean that, that we're not welcoming white teachers. That's not what I'm saying. But there is just a lot of body of research around students who, are able to see their professor, their teacher. And we have already, and that's just in the education world, but in so many places we could be creating this pipeline. And I know we're running out of time, so I'm gonna throw this question out instead of going one by one, and just ask any of you that feel comfortable answering, because I also want to see if there's any questions that that anybody has, and you could throw it in the chat. My question for any of you is, in terms of advice that you have for other organizations around how can they track their progress to know that they're headed in the right direction? And then how can they engage their employees, and most especially underrepresented populations, to gain insight into their sense of belonging and value? So I ask that because we've been so focused on, like the importance of creating that, but then you have that. So how you create like that sense of belonging, and how do you know you're headed in the right direction, and how would you, any advice you have for tracking that progress? So open up to either Sharon, Orrin, or Janay if you'd like to answer.
If you're okay, Janay, I'd like to speak to that. When I think about a holistic approach, and it sounds really simple, but not being afraid to have a conversation. I think that's where it begins. Just being willing and open to have a clear conversation. And when I reflect on my own life, I don't think anybody's ever come to me or offered just to have a conversation. How do you feel? What do you need throughout this process? And when I think about associations or organizations, I like to talk about the 3 Ps of that, and that's people, profit, and productivity. So who's at the table? Who are the people there? And when we think about profit, not necessarily revenue, but what are you gaining? Look at what you can gain from all the diverse talents and people that you can actually bring to the table, which in turn, I think it will increase your productivity. If people feel included, accepted, that they have a voice, I think that your productivity would certainly increase. And then to look at just some specific strategies that you could implement, certainly training, even as a part of my platform, I'm going to implement training for our leaders, for myself, for the board of directors. I think it starts with the top, and we expand that to our constituents to make sure that they can have questions answered in terms of the service delivery process for the diverse groups that they are working with. Mentorship is key. I think it keeps people engaged. It says, you're wanted, I'm willing to invest in you. And I think that sustainability will be more likely with that. Also, having these soft opportunities to embrace difference. It could be lunch and learn, having a podcast, interviewing, I think would be important. And monitoring our language. Is your language inclusive? What terms are you using? Are your terms outdated? I think that's important to visit. But if I had to narrow it to one thing, it would be asking individuals, what do you need to feel comfortable? A simple question, what do you need? Because ultimately, I think our goal should be to ensure that all parties connected to our organizations, our associations, have a clear avenue to engage, and more importantly, they have an optimal experience. What is their experience like? Do we ask individuals that? What has your experience been like? What do you need from us?
You said a mouthful there. I would totally agree on the courageous point. Please go ahead, Janay.
Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. I was going to actually segue from what Sharon said around the point of courageous conversations. I think that is definitely necessary, but one of the things that we talked about too is encouraging people to do the work. I think sometimes when we get in these spaces of equity, it's so easy to say, well, I don't feel that way, or that doesn't affect me, or I don't know because I'm not a person of color, so I can't speak to that. So I encourage people to do the homework, read, pick up an article, like really get involved in the conversation, but also have that really gut check conversation with yourself to say, how am I showing up in this space? And when I show up in that way, how does that reflect against the team that I'm a part of? But also you have to, from a leadership perspective, organizational perspective, you have to make dedicated time. Equity should never be put on your agenda as an item. If you want to have a conversation about equity, it should be a dedicated space that people cannot opt out of. Everyone needs to be present, and everyone needs to be able to participate at a level that's comfortable for them. And then finally, I think for me, this idea of when people say, oh, we need to have more of this or more of that in a space, people instantly go to a deficit mindset. And so I challenge people to go into this place of an asset mindset. It's like when you're working with students, if you tell them, oh, this is going to be so hard, this is going to be so difficult, you have to do all this work, they're going to show up already feeling deflated. So when you're saying you want to have more women, more people of color, more people with disabilities, more people of whatever cultural piece you're missing, you can't approach it from this negative thing of what am I losing? What am I giving up? When I was a law enforcement officer, I know it was like, oh, we can't say those jokes around her because she's a female and she's going to change the dynamic of the space, versus saying she could bring something different into the space that we have. So we have to think of equity not as something that we do, but a mindset that we all have to embody if we want to move the needle forward.
So true. Last words, Orrin?
Yeah, absolutely. First, Sharon and Janay, just an absolute pleasure to be on this panel with you guys. You guys are absolutely amazing. Thank you so much for creating this space for me. I think I would lean on one of my heroes in the SEL space. Her name is Dina Simmons, and she always articulates that good intentions don't equal outcomes. And I think that's a very way of framing this. And when we think about the concepts of moving into diversity and equity, I believe for industry, it's important, to your point, Alex, to build both their cultural and their linguistic competencies. And this can be achieved through workshop as well as professional development so that they are ready to engage with those youth at that time frame. Dr. Soberg, I hope you don't mind. There's an important quote from your book, Making School Relevant with Individual Learning Plans, and you said it so well, and I think this would be my final comments. You said, no matter how much we as educators, community-based organizations, or even family encourage the exploration of careers, there is no greater influence than when an employer looks directly at a young person and states in no uncertain terms that they belong or that they have a future in that industry. I don't think it could be articulated any better than that, because it's absolutely the truth. It's creating those pathways and those bridges, as Jan said, between our employers and between our young people so that they can see themselves in those positions, and employers gaining the benefit from the provision of expanding opportunities, but also those creating those pathways for youth, promoting diversity and inclusion that positively impacts their overall work environments. Really appreciate the opportunity to be here with you all this afternoon.
Thank you so much. And I have to say that I can give a great example, which is when we had our end of year online celebration. Scott was there, and one of our young people is looking for a job, and Scott just typed in, "Hey, I can connect you." And it's so simple, but it's like creating these spaces where we're like all connected and we're connecting young people. And so my last words that I'll just say, thank you so much to Sharon, Orrin, Janay, and thank you so much for letting me also facilitate this session. Last words, you heard all the suggestions and in the chat too, this is a serious subject, but also let's not take it so serious. And for us, I think Sharon talked about courage. So we have to have courage to ask questions. I think we're unfortunately living in a time where anything you say, you feel nervous. I think we all have to be open that this is a learning journey together, and it's okay to ask questions. It's okay to ask about people's culture, obviously respectfully, but I think we have to have the courage, and have the courage in your own workplace. When you see that your team is not diverse and inclusive, to say that, to say, hey, like who is missing here and who do we need to bring? So I will leave it at that. I think we have 2 more minutes. So if there's any burning question on the side that I may have missed. So thank you, everybody. I'll end 2 minutes early. Is that okay? Or you want me to just keep talking?
Alex, that's up to you. I think that the conversation this panel has been so interesting and insightful, and has really makes everybody stop and think. And to your point, it isn't just one way or the other. It can be scary, but it's also very enlightening, and I think it gives us all something to shine for and to move forward on. And so I thought that all of your comments, your insights, the experiences you shared have been really, really great. And we thank you for that. Sharon, Janay, Orrin, Alex, a phenomenal panel. And I know that the whole area of equity and diversity has been discussed by the coalition board, and really looked at, how do we practice what we preach as well? And that's sometimes the hardest thing. We can all say it, we know it, but doing it are 2 different things. So I think this gave a lot to think about. So I appreciate you all being here and sharing, and making us all feel a little uncomfortable sometimes. And I think that's good. I think that's how we change, is to feel uncomfortable. So I thank you all for being part of it.